Hi, you're listening to Bonus Points, the official podcast of Mr. Astel's theology class. Join us as we put out into the deep and explore the world of theology and beyond.
Today, we're talking about the theology of jokes, humor, and everything funny. Let's begin. Hello and welcome to episode 40 of Bonus Points. Wow, 40 episodes. Incredible. As of today, you could listen to an episode of Bonus Points for each day of the entire season of Lent. Hopefully, it's not that much of a penance, though. I do want to say a quick word of thanks to you for listening, whether this is the first time you've tuned in or you're a regular listener. You know, when I started this podcast last year, I kind of had in the back of my head that it would make a few episodes and then kind of fizzle out. I'm a notorious project starter, but I'm certainly much less known for seeing those projects to completion. So for me, the fact that I'm still recording this 40 episodes later, and you're still listening, means there's an element of grace here. I don't dare to say that this podcast is inspired by the Holy Spirit, or that God has called me to be a podcaster, but I do think that we should judge a work by its fruits. And if we judge this show by its fruits, well, then I think it becomes clear that the Holy Spirit is active. This is my hope for you listening to this. I know that I don't have anything original to say, and that there are other people who say it better. All that I can do is hand on what I've received, and to God be the glory. Before we get into today's topic, remember to help this mission grow by subscribing, by rating the show, and by sharing it with somebody. You can also go to bonuspointspodcast.com for more information about today's topic and every topic. You can get a behind-the-scenes look at how each episode of Bonus Points comes to be. You can suggest topics for future episodes, and of course, you can submit questions for our next episode of Question and Astel. And last thing, a quick shout out to my parents who will be celebrating their 30th wedding anniversary the day this comes out. Happy anniversary, Mom and Dad. I've said this before, but I enjoy making this show, and I would probably keep doing it even if I knew that nobody was listening. Part of the reason for that is that it gives me an opportunity to learn new things about our faith and find answers to questions I otherwise may have never thought of. Today's topic is one that I never really thought about much until I read a few different articles that got me thinking, and that I think is where the best episodes come from. It's an interesting thought or question that leads me down a rabbit hole, and then I bring the fruits of that search to you. I bring you on the hunt along with me. The topic of today's episode is, of course, humor. What light can theology shed on good old joke-telling? We'll start by talking about how, for St. Thomas Aquinas, humor, or mirth, is actually a moral virtue. We'll talk about Jesus' sense of humor, and how, at a few points in the Gospels, Jesus even seems to tell a joke. Finally, we'll consider a few moral questions related to humor. Is lying acceptable in the context of a joke? And is it a sin to pull a prank on somebody? First, though, it's good to think about what we're actually talking about when we talk about humor. Believe it or not, St. Thomas Aquinas addresses this in the Summa Theologiae. So, to back up, the Summa, this master work of theology by Thomas Aquinas, literally just means the sum of theology or a summary of theology. It's divided into three parts. The second part is all about morality. And then the second part is further divided into the first part of the second part, the prima secundae, and the second part of the second part, the secunda secundae. And it's that one, the secunda secundae, that deals with specific virtues and vices. So that's the part of the Summa that we're going to be referencing today. In question 168 of the second part, Aquinas addresses, among other things, the morality of games and humor. He begins by noting that we can't work forever. Eventually, our bodies get tired and we have to rest. In last week's episode 39, we talked about rest. And so without even trying to, it seems like I've strung these three episodes together as a sort of mini-series. because in episode 38 we talked about work, episode 39 we talked about rest, and now here in episode 40, didn't even plan for this to happen, we're talking about humor, which Aquinas is going to connect to the need for rest. Anyway, Aquinas points out that when we do physical labor, our physical bodies get tired and we need physical rest. And he's going to say the same thing about our souls. When we engage in work that uses the powers of our soul, especially our intellect, we get tired mentally, right? I'm sure you've experienced this before. Maybe you're studying for finals or you have a major project to work on. If you're in my class, you might have both of those at the same time. Even if you didn't do anything that was physically intense, even if maybe all you did that day was sat there on your computer or in your textbooks, by the end of the day, you still feel exhausted. Aquinas points out that just as we need physical rest to restore our physical tiredness, we need a sort of soul rest. This is where humor and games come in. They are that opportunity for our minds to rest. Aquinas says, and I quote, "Now such like words or deeds, wherein nothing further is sought than the soul's delight, are called playful or humorous. Hence it is necessary at times to make use of them in order to give rest, as it were, to the soul." In other words, to give rest to the soul, we turn to these things, these games, these forms of humor, which he defines as words or deeds wherein nothing further is sought than the soul's delight. And that's very similar to the concept of play that we addressed briefly back in episode 39, that play is something that is sought for its own sake, not some further end. And a few sentences after what I just quoted, St. Thomas refers to mirth as a virtue and lack of mirth as a vice. Listen to this. Quote, "I answer that, in human affairs, whatever is against reason is a sin. Now it is against reason for a man to be burdensome to others, by offering no pleasure to others and by hindering their enjoyment. Now a man who is without mirth not only is lacking in playful speech, but is also burdensome to others, since he is deaf to the moderate mirth of others." In other words, a sense of humor is not only helpful for us to rest our souls, but lacking a sense of humor actually makes us burdensome to the people around us. The next line there, right, there's, "Consequently they are vicious and said to be boorish or rude." So for Aquinas, humor is actually virtuous. It allows us to rest our souls and it builds up our human community. On the other hand, a lack of humor makes us difficult to be around, and it makes it harder for other people to enjoy humor. Now, before we get too far ahead of ourselves, St. Thomas does give a few cautions here. Humor is not an absolute good, meaning you can screw it up if you're not careful. In fact, Aquinas is going to say that it is better to have too little humor than too much. If you're going to fall into one extreme over the other, too little humor is less damaging to you and to your soul than is too much in excess. What do we mean by too much humor? Well, Aquinas conditions the value of humor by saying that it must be used appropriately. It has to be proper, two things, to the situation and to the audience. Specifically, he says that humor is discourteous, insolent, scandalous, and obscene. He says that humor that is discourteous, insolent, scandalous, and obscene, or employs indecent words or deeds, or is injurious to his neighbor, is actually sinful. So that's one way we can turn humor from a virtue into a vice, is when our humor is hurtful or obscene, in other words, the content of the joke is a problem. The other problem has less to do with the content of the joke and more to do with the circumstances surrounding it. St. Thomas says that there's a problem, quote, "For instance, when people make use of fun at undue times or places, or out of keeping with the matter at hand or persons. This may be sometimes a mortal sin, on account of the strong attachment to play when a man prefers the pleasure he derives therefrom to the love of God, so as to be willing to disobey a commandment of God or of the church, rather than forego such like amusements. So we may deploy our sense of humor at the wrong time. It's not virtuous to make a joke when we ought to be serious. We can also fall into the trap of being too attached to jokes or games to the point where we would rather commit a sin than give them up. This is also a problem. The first example that comes to mind is somebody who is so attached to, they're in the middle of a game and mom asks them to do a chore and they respond, "I already did." That's a lie, but they know that if they tell the truth or listen to their parents, they're going to have to stop playing their game. That's not good. Finally, we want to avoid forms of humor based on snark, sarcasm, or tearing others down. If the point of humor is to provide rest for the soul and build up community, these forms of negative or sour humor only serve to do the opposite. So, to summarize, St. Thomas Aquinas has a very positive view of humor, games, jokes. He sees them as ways of resting the soul and building up community, and even says that people without a sense of humor are burdensome to their neighbors. At the same time, Aquinas stipulates that humor must be used well, meaning it should not be a source of injury to others, and it should be appropriate to the situation. So it would seem, for Aquinas at least, that you're better off not being the class clown, but a good sense of humor is a must. Any conversation about virtue should lead us to look at the life of Christ, who models all virtues. Did Jesus have a sense of humor? Did he tell jokes? Though it may be hard to see at first, I think the answer is a resounding yes. If we know what to look for, the Gospels contain quite a few examples of Jesus employing humor. Part of the reason we don't see it right away is that comedy changes over time and between cultures. What we find funny as 21st century Westerners is not universal. Other eras and other cultures have very different senses of humor. Heck, you don't even have to go that far to see how different groups of people use humor differently. Here's an experiment you can try. Take a meme that's popular with high schoolers, show it to somebody over the age of 40, see what they think. Anyway, our sense of humor today is largely based on setting up an expectation and then subverting that expectation. If you think about pretty much every joke you've ever told that isn't a form of wordplay, it often involves creating an idea about what's going to happen and then doing something unexpected. There's that little twist in the punchline. That's why people even laugh at anti-jokes. The very expectation of a punchline is subverted. Now, first century Semitic humor was a bit different than that, and it actually has a good bit in common with humor that exists in that region today. For Jesus' listeners, humor was less about expectations and more about imagery. Using absurd images or examples was a good way to get a laugh out of your audience. And we see Jesus do this a few different times throughout the Gospels. For example, think about some of the images that he uses as part of his teachings. When Jesus is talking about the talents that God gave you, he says that nobody lights a lamp and then puts it under a bushel basket. To caution us against being attached to material things, he tells us that it is easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter heaven. Now, I should say with this example, some people point out that the eye of the needle was a type of a small gate in a city wall, and a camel could only fit through it if it unloaded its cargo. Even if this is the case, on its face, there's still a humorous image being presented here of a camel going through the eye of a needle. And when Jesus talks about paying more attention to your own sins than the sins of others, he says that we love to point out the splinter in our brother's eye, but we ignore the giant wooden beam in our own. And talking to the Pharisees about their hypocrisy, he says they strain out the gnat but swallow the camel. These are all examples of Jesus using imagery that is strange or absurd. It's quite likely that his audience would have found it funny. Even beyond this direct use of humor in, say, his sermons, we also see Jesus displaying a sense of humor, which we can think of as a sort of playfulness. Even though these aren't jokes in the traditional sense for us or for Jesus' time and place, we do see examples of Jesus doing what a good comedian does. He points out the absurdities of our shared life together and pokes a little good-natured fun at it. For example, in Luke 7, Jesus points out that you just can't please some people. He says, quote, "To what then shall I compare the men of this generation, and what are they like? They're like children sitting in the marketplace, calling to one another, 'We piped for you and you did not dance, we wailed and you did not weep.' For John the Baptist has come eating no bread and drinking no wine, and you say, 'He has a demon.' The Son of Man has come eating and drinking, and you say, 'Behold, a glutton and drunkard, a friend of tax collectors and sinners.'" Another time, Jesus uses humor to brush off what he could have very well taken as an insult. In John 1, Philip has just become a follower of Jesus, and he goes to tell Nathanael that they've found the Messiah, Jesus of Nazareth. Nathanael responds, "Can anything good come out of Nazareth?" When he meets Jesus, who, of course, already knows about this comment, he doesn't chastise Nathanael or get mad at him for criticizing his hometown. Instead, Jesus says, "Behold, a true Israelite. There's no guile in you." In other words, he recognizes that Nathanael has a sense of humor, and Jesus knows that he can trust him to say what is on his mind. Speaking of the apostles, we also have the episode where Jesus is rejected by a Samaritan village, and James and John ask Jesus, "Should we call down fire from heaven?" We can imagine Jesus chuckling as he tells them, "No, don't do that." Jesus does give James and John the nickname Boanerges, or Sons of Thunder. Our final example, or rather two examples, are ones you may have heard recently because they've both been part of the readings at Mass not too long ago. When Jesus is invited to a dinner party, he seems to give some very practical social advice. When you go to sit down, choose the lowest seat. That way the host will invite you up to a higher seat and everybody will see you. And if you throw a party, invite the poor because they can't repay the favor and invite you to a dinner party. In another passage, Jesus tells a parable about a dishonest steward. About to be fired, he calls the people who owe his master money and he cancels part of their debt. Why? Because he wants to make sure he has some friends after he gets fired. In these examples, Jesus uses these quote-unquote life hacks to teach deeper spiritual truths. But I bet his listeners got a kick out of them as well. In all of these examples we've just talked about, we see Jesus exhibiting a playfulness with those around him. He doesn't take himself too seriously, and he's able to laugh about the strangeness of things. That reminds me of something, I think it was G.K. Chesterton who said, "Angels can fly because they take themselves lightly." Before we move on, here's a bonus for you, not from the Gospels. In the letter to Philemon, or Philemon, depending how you pronounce it, it seems as though St. Paul makes a pun. For context here, this letter is written to a guy named Philemon concerning his escaped slave, Onesimus. In Greek, the name Onesimus means useful or beneficial. While in verse 11, Paul says, Formerly he was useless to you, but now he is indeed useful to you and to me. And then in verse 20 he says, "Yes, brother, I want some benefit from you and the Lord." So, yeah, dad jokes. The last thing we want to consider is some moral questions related to humor. We've already discussed the virtue of humor, or mirth, according to Aquinas. Now let's take a look at two more specific questions. The first is it okay to lie as part of a joke? After all, many jokes rely on some element of deception or dishonesty. The second question is, are practical jokes okay? So, here's the thing. Lying is a sin. It not only offends against the 8th commandment, but against Christ who is the truth. But does this mean that lying is always a sin? Is it always unacceptable? Or are there circumstances in which it is morally permissible to lie? And if so, is joking one of those circumstances? At some point, I'm going to do a full episode on the morality of lying and whether it's ever okay to lie and all those examples that immediately spring to mind if we say no. It's a lot more complex than you might think, and I think it would be an interesting topic, especially to get into the nitty-gritty of when, according to some theologians, when is it okay to lie? Now, moral theologians agree that lying is bad, but there is some disagreement about whether it is ever justifiable. This is not a new debate, by the way. Even the Church Fathers had these arguments. Origen and St. John Chrysostom say that there are circumstances in which lying is acceptable. One of the fathers, I forget who, compares lying, if there's a case of necessity where one must lie, one should treat it as though swallowing a bitter medicine, not to be enjoyed or relished, simply to be tolerated for the greater good. Augustine, on the other hand, insists there is no such case, that lying is never acceptable. Now, for his part, St. Thomas Aquinas, who is not one of the Church Fathers, he is a medieval philosopher, he follows St. Augustine in saying that lying is always immoral. That said, he distinguishes between three types of lies, what he calls officious, jocose, and mischievous. Officious lies are helpful lies, or lies meant to achieve a purpose. This would include something like a white lie. Mischievous lies are those designed to hurt others or be a detriment to others. The third kind is the kind that's relevant here. Jocose lies are those told to make fun. That's also where we get the word jocular. Alright, so how does this apply to telling a joke? Well, Aquinas defines a lie as a statement that is at variance with the mind. In other words, you speak contrary to what you think. I'd like to quote from the Catholic Encyclopedia here. Of course, what is said merely and obviously in joke cannot be a lie. In order to have any malice in it, what is said must naturally be capable of deceiving others, and must be said with the intention of saying what is false. So this would seem to excuse most types of jokes. You know, if you tell a story that is false, but the person you're talking to knows that you're telling a joke, then it's not a lie, because there's no deception, there's no intent to deceive, there's no actual deception. Things get a little hazier when you think about lying to somebody as a form of joke. You know, you tell your friend there's a test next period just to see them freak out. That one is a little bit harder to justify. So you're probably fine, if you're just telling somebody a joke. In one sense, you could say, well, you're telling a story that's false. But in that case, they know that. It's obviously a joke. They know you're not claiming something to be true. You're not expecting them to take it as true. If you're lying to somebody and that is the joke is that you are deceiving them, that you are misleading them, I don't know. I think that's a little bit harder to excuse. This brings us to the question of pranks or practical jokes. What would a moral theologian say about pranking somebody? Like with any joke, we have to consider the substance of the joke, the intent behind it, and the circumstances surrounding it. Everything we said above applies here. Pranks that are obscene or rude, or that are pulled in an inappropriate time, are not okay. Here's a good rule of thumb for pranks. At the end of it, everybody, including the person pranked, should be laughing. If you're laughing and they're not, something is wrong there. So practical jokes are acceptable, again, as long as the content of the practical joke is not obscene, it doesn't damage people or their property. As long as it is pulled at an appropriate time, there are certainly many, many times when, funny or not, a prank would really not be the thing to do right now. But other than that, there are times when they're acceptable. And finally, along with this question, I'd like to share 2 examples of saints who played practical jokes. These guys are living proof that humor has a place in the Christian life. The first one is St. John Bosco. As a priest, he focused his ministry on young people, and especially poor boys who lived in the streets. Because he knows that young people often have a short attention span, he used magic tricks to keep their attention. He used humor to keep them interested. Well, a few of his brother priests found his unorthodox methods to be troubling. They didn't know what to do with the priest who did magic tricks, who was juggling in the streets. They were so troubled, in fact, that they wanted to take him away to an asylum. So they wanted to trick him in going with them to the asylum. So they called a carriage. They went to go pick him up and said, "Oh yeah, we're gonna go for a ride. Why don't you get in the carriage with us?" Now here's the thing: St. John Bosco knew what they were planning. So he's standing with them. The carriage pulls up. He lets them get in first. And then he slams the door, slaps the horses, and tells the driver, "To the asylum." They're expecting them. Of course, we can't talk about saints and practical jokes without mentioning St. Philip Neri. He's so well known for his pranks that he is the patron saint of laughter and jokes. He used to play pranks on the seminarians that lived with him. Sometimes he would give, when priests asked for directions to a particular place, he would give them wrong directions. Here's the thing, though. He didn't exempt himself from all this. He often played pranks that were self-deprecating or at least self-humiliating. For example, he would show up to fancy functions with half of his beard shaved. St. Philip was a good example of having a sense of humor, but not being the class clown. He knew when it was and was not appropriate to deploy a practical joke, and the goal was never to hurt anybody or leave them upset. This brings us to the final point I'd like to make before we conclude. There's a relationship between humor and humility. You can kind of hear it in the words. Both come from the Latin humus, or ground. Both humor and humility are about keeping us down to earth, keeping us grounded. If you think of people in your life who are lacking humility, you'll probably find that they have trouble laughing at themselves. They get offended easily, not only when it's justified, but anytime their pride is wounded. Humor helps keep us down to earth by reminding us that we shouldn't take ourselves too seriously. We are imperfect, and our world can be absurd sometimes. Humor helps deal with it. St. Augustine said that the four most important virtues are humility, 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 and humility. If you want a quick test to see how strong you are in this virtue, think about what your first response to humor would be. Is your first impulse to get snarky or to laugh at yourself? On that, episode 40 draws to a close. May God give us the virtue of mirth, the humility to laugh at ourselves, and the prudence to know when to make that joke. So what resources can I offer you this time? Oh man, do I have some good ones for you. We'll have the Summa Theologiae, specifically question 168 of the Secunda Secundae. This is where Aquinas describes the virtue of mirth and whether lack of mirth is a sin. I'll have a link to an essay from Oxford Biblical Studies on humor in the New Testament and an article about Jesus' sense of humor. I'm linking to an article titled The Seriousness of Humor. That was kind of the inspiration for the episode. That was the article that really got the ball rolling here. You can find more Aquinas, another link to the Summa, specifically question 110 of the Secunda Secundae. This is where Aquinas deals with the question of lying. I'm linking to an Epic Pew article about saints and practical jokes, as well as an article specifically about St. Philip Neri. Oh, and I forgot to mention the Catholic Encyclopedia, specifically the article on lying. The Catholic Encyclopedia is such a fantastic resource. It was compiled sometime in the early 1900s. I have the year 1917 in my head, but I don't know why. But the whole thing is available for free, both on newadvent.org and on the Catholic Answers website. You may have noticed that particular resource, the Catholic Encyclopedia, has been cited in more than one episode. That's why it's a pretty good resource. As always, you can find these resources and more by going to bonuspointspodcast.com. Until next time, I'm Mr. Astle. This is Bonus Points. Thank you for listening for 40 episodes of Putting Out into the Deep, exploring the world of theology and beyond.